Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios, welcome to this evening's episode of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo. Thank you for tuning in. Here's what we have in store for you. A huge blow for public sector unions as the Constitutional Court rules in favor of the government. We get their leaders' reaction. And with both the President and his Finance Minister talking tough, we look at the possible future of some of state-owned enterprises and that of their workers. We also look at whether today's special session of the United Nations Assembly will do anything to stop Russia's invasion of Ukraine. All that coming up in tonight's edition of The Watchdog, which starts right now. Public sector unions have lost their Constitutional Court bid to force government to honor its 2018 three-year wage agreement. This after government reneged on some aspects of this collective wage agreement, citing lower tax revenue. The salary increase would have added 38 billion rand on the high public sector wage bill. Notando Magudlulela reports.
The Constitutional Court dismissed the public sector union's application for permission to appeal a 2020 Labour Appeal Court judgment. In that judgment, the Labour Appeal Court dismissed the union's application to enforce Clause 3.3 of the collective agreement. The said clause determined the public sector wage increases for the 2020-21 financial year. SABC General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi says they are disappointed in the court's ruling.
They decided that workers, in the light of the difficulties faced by the capitalist class in 2008, 2009, now worsened by the coronavirus, that it is workers, not anybody else, who must pay and suffer the consequences of that. The Constitutional Court ignored all our argument that South Africa doesn't face a debt crisis and South Africa does not face a fiscal crisis. It is a policy choice of government that it is facing that fiscal crisis, that resources are available in this country through taxation, including wealth and solidarity tax. All of these have been ignored by the court. We are extremely disappointed because this then throws collective bargaining into disarray, and it makes any worker to know upfront that unless you win the battle in the streets through strike action, don't ever take your battles to the courts because you're more likely to lose.
In his budget speech last week, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana announced a marginal increase of 1.8% to the public wage bill for the current financial year. He also expressed concern over the rising debt levels that pose a risk on the fiscus. The minister is expected to meet with labour unions next month to address the issue of the public sector wage bill. Notando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Let's get more reaction to this story, one of the big stories of the day, this time from Nehau, one of the biggest public sector unions. Its president is Mike Shingange, who joins us on the line. Mike, obviously very disappointed.
No, of course, we are disappointed, and good evening to your viewers. We are disappointed not only because of the judgment, but because also of the president itself. Going forward about the future of the collective bargaining in this country, including the trust deficit that has now been crushed to the bottom end, and the morale of the public servants that have been crushed to the bone, now that it has always been demoralized because they were understaffed, because they were underpaid, because they didn't get the salary increase in 2020, because their colleagues around them died in the past 2 years over coronavirus. Those posts have not been filled. Now this judgment, you want them to wake up tomorrow and still very motivated to service the ever-growing population of South Africa. So we're very disappointed on that part because of what the judgment does to the South African population and its workers.
Do you not accept the argument, or the one argument that says there simply isn't enough money to go around?
That was never the argument. Because if that was the argument, the state would not have asked the court to declare the agreement to be unlawful. The argument, at least as from where we stand, is that the state, as an employer of the democratic government, believes that collective bargaining in this country is not lawful. If the issue was about the money, firstly, they would not have signed the agreements. If the issue was about the money, after 2 years of implementing the first and the second year, they would have renegotiated the repayment. If you do not have the money to meet the end of your bargain on the basis of the agreement you have signed, you don't ask the court that must lawfully allow you to walk away. You renegotiate with the person with whom you've got an agreement. You renegotiate with the person whom you owe about how you're going to pay back. So the issue of the money, we don't think is an issue here, because had that been brought in as an argument, it would have been negotiated. At no point that you, if you have got a contract with anybody else, if you can't pay, you ask the law to get you scot-free. We don't think that is the argument.
Do you think, looking back, that they negotiated in bad faith?
Of course. In fact, today, and of course some few months and years ago, but more now and into the future, it will be difficult to trust anybody who represents the state in any negotiating table. It will be difficult to look the state in the eye and believe that they are negotiating in good faith, that they are negotiating genuinely, that they will not trick the workers, because it is not the workers' fault that the people who represented the state in the first instance did not know or did not do due diligence in as far as some clauses that have been quoted by the court that they were supposed to be adhered to before. It is not the workers' fault. And funny enough, the court is not finding anything about that. The people who got us into where we are, where the workers are in such emotional distress, the country is on the edge, because at no point, no way you are going to expect the what so-called professionalization and incentivized and motivated public service tomorrow. So it would be very difficult for us at any given point to engage with the state, not thinking that they're actually once again tricking us into signing something that they know that in future they're going to use the technicality of the law to get out of the agreement and hope that life must go on as if nothing has happened. So they did negotiate in bad faith. It's an indictment on them. It's an indictment even on the cabinet as led and chaired by President Ramaphosa, because that agreement was actually sanctioned by the cabinet, which is a mandating committee that we have always known of over the years that we've conducted collective bargaining. It's not something new that we negotiated in this manner that we've negotiated.
Now, it's the Apex Court that has made this ruling. So where to from here? Or is that it?
We will always find ways of making sure that nobody is allowed to forget the matter that we have got the con artists that have conned their own employees. We will not always find a way that we recoup the lost wages that workers lost in 2020. Remember, we went to 2017, 2018 to negotiate not for a multi-term agreement, but for a one-year agreement. The state pleaded and made us to concede or to compromise not on the other demands, but even on the demands of a one-year term, and we signed a 3-year agreement, only for them to renege on the last year. Therefore, what it means is that had we known that in 2020 there will be no agreement that is binding and lawful in place, we would have negotiated for the cost of living adjustment for our members in 2020. To the extent that we didn't do that because we trusted that we've got the agreement in place, it means we've got to go back there and see what we can get for our members on that year. But again, we are moving into the second year of the 2022-2023 wage agreement. We'll have to see how much we utilize that negotiations to make sure that we claw back on the areas that our members have lost. But we're also going to demand accountability, in particular the president and his cabinet, for having misled South Africans and the workers into believing that they have sanctioned an agreement, that they're going to later take a decision that is actually not lawful. So we're not going to let this matter go just like that. We respect that's the Apex Court. We will see what other legal avenues we have, including applying for rescission if that advice is going to come our way. But if it doesn't, we will always make sure that workers are not under their watch robbed by their own employer that they so much trusted.
Okay, that's all going to leave it. Thank you very much, Mr. Shingange, for your time this evening. He is the president of one of the biggest public sector unions now, but is also the deputy president of the Congress of South African Trade Unions. On the back of that decision by the Constitutional Court, which means that the government can be forced to honor that 2018 three-year agreement. We're going to leave this story there for now. After the break, we continue to look at the implications of Finance Minister Godongwana's budget speech. Our focus this evening is on state-owned enterprises. The future of many state-owned enterprises hangs in the balance if senior ministers and officials are to be believed this time around. But which among the big ones could go, based on what criteria, and what could be the implications for their respective mandates, as well as the workers who work at these institutions? Well, to help us answer these questions, Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, who is a developmental economist with Stellenbosch University's Business School. Lebohang Pheko is an economist with the Trade Collective. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Will.
Well, I mean, we've been talking about, what should happen to these state-owned enterprises for a while. I don't know whether you got the sense that this time around, this exercise is indeed going to be carried through. Lebong? Lebong, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I'm saying, are you convinced that this process this thing is going to happen?
Oh, the tough love, the rationalization, the consolidation. This is an old conversation, Vuyo and the viewers. So remember that some years ago, about 12, 13 years ago, Maria Piecha chaired a very important process, the presidential review on SOE committees and on state-owned enterprises, I should say, which was looking at these very questions. And there were quite a few interesting things that the commission was tasked to do. One was to explore whether or not SOEs and their failure or their deficits were exaggerated or in some way avoidable. Another piece was whether or not these state-owned enterprises would perform better if they were privately owned, for example. Another was whether or not SOEs could actually be reformed, and whether it was possible for them to self-correct and to correct themselves from within, and also whether the inefficiencies are really a part of inherent government, government interference, or sort of the legacy of where state-owned enterprises come from, which was really, 100 years ago, about trying to build a cohort of businesses which would be able to stand up for the Afrikaners, which would be able to stand up economically against over-reliance on British imports, and also on British on the British economy, because of the time, of course, this was and still, a settler colony state. And I think that what has happened in the interim is that there really hasn't been much vigor in trying to address any of those issues. So these are not new questions for you. This whole notion of tough love, even as recently as last year, the Presidential State-Owned Enterprises Council was stating that they need to support the reform process, making important but still muted noises about state SOE consolidation, which we can talk about later, and also whether or not it's possible to implement what they call a centralized SOE model, which would then standardize governance, financial management, and operationalize performance management for all SOEs. I didn't hear any of this in Minister Godongwana's budget in relation to the state-owned enterprises, nor have these conversations seemed to have gained much public traction.
Nthabiseng, what is your sense?
I think we always have to go back to the beginning, Rio. The question really that is fundamental is what was the intended purpose for state-owned enterprises? And I think that one of the key things that we're losing in this discussion is what was the problem that we were trying to deal with at the very beginning. Many of these were inherited. You would know the history dates back some as far back as 1912, primarily because of their mandate. So one of the things that I want to just point out is that globally, state-owned enterprises are not a new thing. They primarily are set up to build domestic capabilities, and they're not always having commercial strategic objectives. So you can have legitimate non-economic sovereign reasons for setting up state-owned enterprises. I think the second thing is that you really want to put in place a reason for building a competitive edge over competitors, primarily when you're talking about building industrial capacity. You use your SOEs, you call them SOEs or SOCs, but they're really there to enable infant industry or nascent industry development within the economic subsectors primarily. So they're correcting market failures where the government has to intervene to deal with that.
Let's take a few examples. For example, Denel. There's been every indication that government wants it to stay. They believe, or they seem to believe, that there is still a business case for that entity. But again, you ask yourself, has government taken cognizance of what actually went wrong? And as you were saying, Lebohang, earlier, its hand, in other words, how it managed these entities, and then analyze the situation carefully so that it can arrive at whatever conclusion, whether to keep or get rid of it. Is there, from where you sit, Lebohang, a business case for a state-owned entity like Denel?
It depends on what our key strategic priorities are, Vuyo. And I think what state-owned enterprises ideally should do is to be in alignment with our the business case, as Ndabi Singh said, and also what it is we want to achieve. If we want to be, for example, leaders in military technology, if we want to be leaders, for example, in energy production, in the case of ESCOM. And what we are seeing at the moment is that a lot of these SOEs are the product of a time and the context which may have evolved, some of which have fallen away. And in the case of Denel, I think the question has to be asked is, what is the key strategic plan for it? There is a 5-year strategy that has been designed and that has been designed with the view to restructuring it and making it leaner and meaner. And it's littered with words like repurposing, fit for purpose, profitability, sustainability. But when we think about, a merger or a restructured operating model of Denel, which is perhaps has the potential to develop a knowledge base to then be restructured for efficiency. And I think efficiency can be a very loaded term, which can be a bit more agile and which can also help to lead to a diversified economy. I have to ask myself, what is actually the purpose of a Denel for a country which really hasn't got that much military expertise or military prowess per se? We're not a country at war. We're not a country who per se trades in goods and services of military expertise, for example, or who we're not a country like, say, in the United States, whose core business is often linked to war and who have a huge military expenditure. And fortunately, we don't have a heck of a lot of enemies either. So what then would be the purpose of salvaging this sort of an SOE? Could it not be rationalized or consolidated into another subset, another sub-operation somewhere else in the state, and why that one should be per se rescued as opposed to others? Because unless it fits in with our key strategic mandate as outlined in the national planning, our national planning architecture, so to say, our state security architecture, and even our international relations footprint, we need to ask ourselves, what is the rational reason for it still being an investment, and us seeing it as receiving a return on that investment.
Ndabi Singh, we know for a fact that ESCOM stays and is being reorganized and repurposed and all of that. We also know for a fact, well, government says it's not going to put money on South African Airways, although it retains a minority stake in the business. Which other state-owned entity appeals to you, or you think is or still has a role?
I think just to start off on the last question and I think the question for you is framed in a certain way. The question you pose is about financial viability, commercial viability. I think there are other aspects which are critical in answering your question. The question that needs to be asked when you look at the plethora of state-owned enterprises is what measure, what tool will be used to determine what is viable or not. So you could look at the governance, you could look at the developmental impact, you could look at the financial stability, and you could look at the commercial viability. These are all four different very key things. And I think that in looking at, for example, Denel, if you're looking at financial stability, you could argue that in the last 5 years, the financial performance, looking at all ratios of Denel, have really been underperforming. Whether you're looking at sales, whether you're looking at losses over the period under review. But if you look at innovation and you're talking development impact now, you could look at the IP that Denel has produced in terms of what they call the Rooivalk helicopter. There is Umkhondo's missile that was developed, artillery systems that were developed by Denel. There are various other ammunition and long-range missiles that were developed by South Africa, who had market share clients and so forth across the globe. These are other type of measures that you can use to assess, the success and the performance of Denel. Now, to go to your question on whether or not would you retain a Denel or any other, the question is, do we deem the military, the IP, the investment and the research and development into these missiles and these capabilities worth nothing? Do we then give them up? Remember, the history of Denel goes back to around 1912. 1940s. I'm talking about the land bank, 1940s with Denel. If you look at the land bank, which you've just mentioned, it goes back to 1912. And primarily, these were set up as development priorities for the state then to deal with underdevelopment in agriculture, to provide cheap finance. This is a development goal. All of these SOEs that I'm talking about and I'm pulling out, if you look at the financial performance alone over their history, there have been what I call booms and busts. There have been contributing factors to overall commercial viability and overall losing financial viability due to political systems, ups and downs in the sales and the revenues generated, even in the loan performance, particularly of your DFIs. But what the state has done is, depending on the prioritization and the development mandate and goal of the state, that determines whether or not there is a need for the SOE or whether there is not a need. Would there be a need for a land bank if we go to the land bank? Absolutely. Why would I say that for you? I'd say that because of the need for commercial farming, where emerging farmers need to enter. Primarily, it was set up to provide cheap commercial funding for Afrikaans or white farmers. And now we are still seeing that gap in emerging farmers not being able to enter into the financial space and even the agricultural processing space, primarily because of the inhibiting or those limitations and barriers to entry. So these market failures, if we are satisfied that they've been addressed as a country, we can then review some of the SOEs. But if we still see that as the barriers to entry remain, I would then argue that many of these development institutions, SOEs, instead of us removing them, let's build the capacity, the capability of those entities. Let's fix the governance. Let's build the institutional management of those to ensure that they can compete with the private sector, but not simply derail and remove them because of inefficiencies that are because of other factors. If you deal with those root causes, you would still have those market failures that the private sector cannot respond to. So I think that we need to be very careful how we decide what is to stay and what is to go? What is the basis? What is it that we're looking at? Economic efficiency is not the only goal that state-owned enterprises have. And I think we've got to have that balance when we talk about rationalizing, when we talk about restructuring. Has the intended goal from the onset been met? If not, we probably need to look at why are the problems there and what therefore do we need to do in reviewing and also turning these institutions around. But to simply remove them because there's a problem, I don't go with that.
Rebohang, has there been any evidence from the most recent pronouncement by the president, but also the Minister of Finance, that the Presidential State-Owned Enterprises Council that the president announced is indeed going to think broadly and widely when making final determinations about which of these entities should go, which should stay, and what should happen to make them viable, but also for them to deliver on the mandates that their respective mandates. Has there been any evidence that the state is thinking differently this time around?
So I mean, certainly I'm not sure if they're thinking differently, but what they are thinking about, it would appear, would be stabilization of state-owned enterprises, would also be repositioning SOEs to become a bit more commercially competitive. And I think when we speak about competitive, one has to ask relative to what and relative to whom, and also management of turnaround strategies and turnaround processes. But also of course, to remember that in relation to state-owned enterprises and also in relation to the previous studies that were done in this regard and the very excellent work that's been done. And unfortunately, we're in the habit as a country of often abandoning the good work that had already transpired. But really, whether or not it's important to think around the role of state-owned enterprises as part of a developmental state, and what is required for SOEs to be able to run more efficiently, and for the environment to then improve their performances, and what this would entail. I do think, however, that there is a case to be made for rationalization or for rethinking the existence of some of these SOEs, mainly because the environment that we're dealing with now and the context that we're dealing with now may not necessarily be the one that was the original genesis of a construction of many of these. And things need to evolve. And I think that institutions, formations, mandates, and context change. They are fluid, and they also need to be responsive. And I think the word agile keeps on popping up. And if we look back at institutions such as ISCOR, for example, which eventually were really, there was a particular model which was utilized for state-owned enterprises to survive. And that was really through very close partnerships with other companies, with private-owned entities, and also with very locked-in agreements, sealed-in agreements. For example, Eskom used to provide power to what was then problematically the Victoria Fall Power Company, and in this regard, they passed on the cost to their mining customers at a very hefty profit, rather than what is happening now, where the cost of those, where the cost of electricity and energy and tariffs are passed on to us as consumers. And I do also think that we have to think through the fact that the other form and the other genesis of this was really to build monopolies. So when the UK, for example, called on South Africa to provide bullets and to provide goods, multiple goods for the war effort, 1939 to 1945, this also intensified local manufacturing of a lot of goods. But I don't think that we can uncritically keep a hold of SOEs, even in 2022, which per se may have either not be fulfilling their mandate, or the mandate needs to be shifted quite considerably. And I think that there's also scope in this new dispensation to rethink a post-code, how these align to a post-code, if there's such a thing, but certainly an ongoing 2 to 5 year plan to move us to to provide the infrastructure of technology transfer, for the kind of skills base and the kind of forward-looking planning that is going to enable us to recover, or to reconfigure ourselves, because I don't think recovery really happens, but to reconfigure ourselves economically, coming out of, or adjusting to the reality of COVID-19.
And Tom saying, I know that at the Tees Post SONA briefing, the president did, I think, mention a couple of companies and models that he was looking at. Are there, as far as you know, models, where that we could or should perhaps be looking into right now?
Absolutely. I think that the intent of SOEs is that you have to look at how do you reduce the fixed cost of production for entities in this sector, or the variable cost primarily. Why they have that edge or over their competitors, whether you're looking at them as monopolies or oligopolies, is because from a regulatory perspective, they either don't have competition, or even if they do have competition, it's few and far in between, and they are highly subsidized, or they get concessionary finance to actually make them cheaper and able to perform better than their competitors. On the other side, when you talk about what is the most viable model, you've got to really have regulatory frameworks, one, that review regularly the performance of these entities. And now you'd ask yourself the question, with all these reports that Lebogang has just mentioned that have been happening since 2009, 2013, the Presidential Coordinating Council and so forth, these institutional mechanisms that are supposed to oversee these entities have to be effective in actually monitoring the efficacy and meeting the mandate of those SOEs. I think the second thing, in terms of how you would set up and build, I think, successful models for these, is that you've got to have appropriate funding models for each. I don't think one size fits all. So we know that many of them have high level of government guaranteed debt. There have been a real strain on the fiscus, particularly with National Treasury. We also know that in terms of the rating sovereignty, it's very expensive debt, primarily because of the issues of the balance sheet and the viability going forward of some of these SOEs. So what we need to look at is, what are the appropriate funding models once you have decided what are the critical ones to keep? I think that in deciding which are critical to keep, you've got to decide on your economic development strategy. I go to the other countries that have SOEs. China has over 100,000 state-owned enterprises across manufacturing particularly. Norway, I mentioned a European country, has over 70 SOEs, particularly across social sectors. Thailand is another example. All the BRICS economies, actually, India, China, have a very high component of what they call the share of SOEs in relation to others. Even in the OECD economies, where you have a high proportion of companies that are actually state-owned companies. We try to talk about this in South Africa as though it's an anomaly. It's actually a global phenomenon. Many countries do it. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. What do? They have what we call integration, coordination amongst their economic clusters. They also have a very clear goal of either dominance in the mining sector, dominance in the oil sector, dominance in aviation. They're very clear, or electrical goods and components. And they use these state-owned companies, even in the US, to either buy cheaper IT in terms of IP for proprietary technologies. They also use them to lower the input cost. I spoke about that at the beginning, so that you have an edge with your own state-owned companies, and you can expand either your global market access or your market share domestically, or you build your capabilities and your value chains in industrialization. So what is key here is that you've got to hear what is the development goal of the country. If we're saying we're happy with where we are as a country, 12.5 million unemployed, manufacturing, deindustrialization, loss of jobs, which is really a bloodbath, as we have heard many analysts and economists say, 77% unemployment in the youth. We're seeing in former Bantustan's the economic stagnation that we have continued to see post-1994. If you look at per capita GDP, GNI, all of these indices are taking us back to where we were in 1994. I think that what we should do in integrating SOEs is look at what are the critical ones that will advance an industrialization strategy, that will build a manufacturing capability, that will enhance labor absorptive, building our labor absorptive sectors. These then should be the ones that we keep, that enable us to change the economic productive structure. If they don't, then maybe we could review keeping them or absorbing or consolidating, but to review and to leave those that don't deal with the failures of the market, we would have a problem, because we'd still remain with the fundamental problems of underdevelopment and inequality in the country.
Okay. Final thoughts from you, Lebang?
I think in terms of different forms of reconfiguring state-owned enterprises, for example, that we have several options at our disposal. And the level of government that owns the enterprise, so central, federal, state, regional, or local. And for some years, I've been suggesting that we could think around how to decentralize the modalities of SOEs, because oftentimes the geography and the size and the scope, just the bulkiness of that, I think makes them quite unmanageable. And I also think that it makes it more difficult to assess, especially in the case of something like an ESCOM, which needs to have much deeper and wider lateral and vertical coverage across the country, where one would think that it might be better served by being somehow decentralized and based in different regional nodes, for example. And the other is to think about majority or minority ownership by government, listing on the stock exchange, which I'm not personally in favor of, because I think if a state-owned enterprise is at the behest of the state and runs a state development mandate, it needs to be state-owned. Government shareholdings through vehicles such as pension funds, asset management funds, which again makes it a quasi-PPP type arrangement. And finally, perhaps state-enabled. So enterprises which have been given exclusive rights as opposed to being entirely state-owned. So almost like monopolies, in fact, state monopolies rather than being state-owned. But I do also think that we have to think around the harmonization of how we are able to think through the efficacy of SOEs in relation to their purpose and in relation to the kind of development mandate that we want to create, in relation to the employment targets that we want to set, and also in relation to the skills gap that we want to achieve, particularly, and the skills base we want to build over the next 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. Unfortunately, I think that SOEs have been left out of extremely important, or left themselves out of extremely important state planning and state coherent planning, which would then enable us to make much more informed decisions, or the decision makers to make much more coherent decisions around which are the ones that need to stay in place and perhaps which are the ones that can fade away into the sunset. But I do think the current slightly ad hoc model is not, and the bailout model is really not sustainable. I've said so many times. And I also think that it is extremely unfortunate that the excellent work that's been done over the last 10, 15 years around ways to do things differently and also ways to learn from other contexts has not really been, it doesn't seem to have been taken much into account.
Susan Indictment. Well, special thanks to both of you. Lebang Pego is an economist with the Trade Collective. Dr. Ntabiseng Molego is a developmental economist with Stellenbosch University's Business School. To this story now, the biggest story in the world. A United Nations General Assembly's emergency special session is currently underway in New York on the question of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The matter was referred to the 193-member assembly after a vote in the Security Council yesterday. More than 107 countries are inscribed on the speaker's list, with South Africa also expected to participate, with the meeting expected to stretch into tomorrow, when a vote on a draft resolution condemning Russia's actions is expected to take place. These were some of the opening speakers in today's debate.
The United Nations Charter, drafted so soon after the Second World War, is based on the principle of sovereign equality. It outlines a world where member states settle their international disputes by peaceful means without the threat or use of force. The ongoing military offensive is inconsistent with this. It is an affront to the founders of this organization and everything it stands for. The violence must stop. Humanitarian law and international humanitarian law must be respected, and diplomacy and dialogue must prevail.
This escalating violence, which is resulting in civilian deaths, including children, is totally unacceptable. Enough is enough. Soldiers need to move back to their barracks, and leaders need to move to peace. Civilians must be protected. International humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld. The sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders must be respected.
The General Assembly should be vocal in demanding from the Russian Federation to stop its offensive against Ukraine. In recognizing Russian actions as an act of aggression against a sovereign and independent state, in demanding from Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, in demanding from the Russian Federation to reverse the decision related to the status of certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine, in demanding full compliance with the provisions of international humanitarian law.
I wish to emphasize the following. The root for the current crisis lies in the actions of Ukraine itself. For many years, it sabotaged and flouted its direct obligations under the Minsk package of measures. Just recently, very recently, there was a hope that in Kiev they would reconsider and that they would indeed comply with what they signed on to back in 2015. For that, first and foremost, what was necessary was direct dialogue, as set out in the document, between Donetsk and Lugansk. However, the latest confirmation from the senior leadership of the country was that Ukraine was unwilling to engage in this dialogue, and they took unwilling to take steps to grant special status to Donbass, as set out in the Minsk agreements, and this was actively supported by the Western patrons of Kiev.
The world, meanwhile, is keenly awaiting the outcomes of the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine on the Belarus border. South Africa has thrown its weight behind the negotiations, hoping that they will succeed. But concerns remain as people continue to die. Russia has also put its nuclear deterrence forces on high alert as the world slaps Moscow with sweeping sanctions for invading Ukraine.
Ukraine and Belarus were once brothers under the once influential Soviet Union, but the socialist states fell apart in the early 90s, and multiple former members chose their own destinations. Fast forward to 2022, Eastern Europe is seized with a critical issue to find peace in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. For some South Africans, like the ANC heavyweight Tokyo Sexwale, who received military training in Russia and Ukraine, this is a very difficult time.
I lived in Moscow. We did our theoretical trainings in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, at the time called Leningrad. For physical training, tanks, rockets, all those type of things, we lived in the south, in Ukraine. The Russians and the Ukrainians welcomed us. They are brothers, they are sisters. It's so sad today to see them at daggers drawn, or at tanks drawn, or at rockets drawn. Yeah. Somehow this war has got, somebody must pause. The parties have got to find a way of sitting down and settling.
The United Nations Security Council has referred the matter to the UN General Assembly, but later this week, the Western Bloc is expected to bring the Ukraine-Russia conflict before the Human Rights Council. The second largest economy, China, is likely not to throw its weight behind the matter, as it has shown support to Moscow. Meanwhile, security has been heightened around cities in Ukraine, and this is what transpired when UNICEF rep crossed to SABC News.
Sorry, guys, I work for UNICEF, United Nations. Of course. He's got my document. So I'm just doing live television.
Yeah.
No problem. Can I continue?
Please, we have to.
Of course.
Yes, we have to check your document.
Of course.
And you can.
Guys, I'll just pause here and we'll kick off again in a few minutes.
The US remains adamant that the sanctions will put pressure on Moscow.
In terms of the sanctions, yes, we are looking for a non-violent way to make a cost to Vladimir Putin for what he's doing. We've got to turn it back, and we are seeing a dramatic drop in the value of the ruble. We're seeing tremendous inflation. There were long lines in Moscow.
While Moscow says no one would benefit from these sweeping sanctions.
All the West has been doing lately is introducing sanctions on basically any basis against Russia. So I wanted to say that these sanctions are not for the benefit of Europe, not for the benefit of Russia, not for the benefit of the entire world, because it will have the world is globalized now, and it's going to have the global consequences.
South Africa says it's helping its citizens who are caught up in the crossfire after reports of racism surfaced.
We've advised these South Africans to move to the borders of countries that are receiving refugees and people fleeing from this armed conflict. This includes Poland, Romania, Hungary, Moldova and others. Ambassador Mgomezulu has been on the ground at the Ukraine-Poland border.
Pretorius further welcomed the peace talks aimed at stopping the conflict in Ukraine. Kailihle Kumalo, SABC News, Pretoria.
Well, tonight, the Western Cape Provincial Parliament and Table Mountain are lit in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. One of the people behind this campaign, DA leader John Steenhuisen, joins us from where it all happened. Good evening, John. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Vuyo, and I must just correct you. I'm not behind the campaign. It was an initiative of the Western Cape Speaker, Masazole Mkhasela, who had agreed to light it up. I was just lucky enough to be able to go and witness the lights being switched on this evening.
Okay, and the point of it?
Well, I think it's to show solidarity with the people of the Ukraine, and particularly the civilians who are caught up in this armed conflict, innocent civilians who've had their homes bombed and are being displaced in large numbers and turned into refugees because of the invasion by the Russian Federation into Ukraine. And to show that we are in solidarity with them in this difficult time that their country finds itself in.
I mean, a lot of opposition leaders have been critical of the way our government is handling the plight of the South Africans who are caught in this whole confusion.
Well, of course, and I think it is the most unfortunate, but it's the same thing we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa really does struggle to take care of its citizens abroad, and much of this is going to fall into private citizens and private organizations to be able to help assist getting those refugees back to safety, first of all, and then hopefully repatriated as quickly as possible.
And is that it? Was it just the lighting up both the legislature and the Table Mountain?
I'm sorry, I'm struggling to hear you. There's a lot of feedback from your studio.
Okay, apologies for that. I hope that it's sorted now. But what I was asking was whether this is it. It's just what Marcela has suggested, or are you going to be doing other things, as time progresses to keep the focus on the plight of Ukrainians?
Yes, of course. As you know, we've already called for a parliamentary debate on the situation in Ukraine. And I think it is important that as parliaments around the world convene to discuss this latest crisis, that South Africa does the same. We are going to be very badly affected by this in a number of ways. First of all, we import a great deal of grain from Ukraine. It's also going to have an impact on fuel prices, which have already jumped quite exponentially this year, as well as a variety of other products which we receive from Ukraine. And obviously, this is going to mean that the cost of living is going to go up significantly for ordinary South Africans. I think it is important that we do discuss this as well, because the government's position on it is very unclear. We've got a Minister of DIRCO, Naledi Pandor, who issues a statement calling for the withdrawal of the Russian troops out of Ukraine. 2 hours later, her counterpart from the Defense Ministry is with the SANDF chief at the Russian embassy, drinking champagne, celebrating the Russian armed services. And then we saw in the weekend papers the president walking away from DIRCO's statement. So I think it is very important that the president and his government say exactly where they stand on this crisis. It's been literally as clear as mud over the course of the last 3 to 4 days.
Well, we're going to leave it there for now. Thank you very much for your time this evening. That's the DA leader, John Steenhuisen, fresh from a function where they were showing solidarity with the Ukrainians. Tonight, the provincial legislature as well as Table Mountain are lit in Ukrainian colors as a show of solidarity. Before we go, let me give you some news from the presidency. They released a statement a short while ago saying that the president has appointed a new director general for intelligence. So you have a new spoke. President Cyril Ramaphosa has appointed Ambassador Thembisile Majola as the new director general of the State Security Agency, SSA, with effect from 1 March. I'm sure our journalists will be following this story, but the president has also made several high-level appointments at the National Prosecuting Authority. That story we will be following for you as well, but these two media releases were sent a short while ago. And that's how we come to the end of tonight's program. To join us again tomorrow evening, 8 p.m. sharp. Have a good night.